I have been given the signal. I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. Thursday, February 25th. Welcome to everyone. First item up is approval of agenda, please. Look for a motion to move and receive. Moved by Duncan. Do we have a seconder? Mike. Please call the vote, Catherine.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Councillor Giguere. Councillor McPhail.
Yes.
Mike Andrews.
Yes.
Justin Pennings. Oh, I think we lost Justin. Warden Marks.
Yes.
4-1, the motion is carried.
Thank you for that. Looking to adopt our minutes from February the 11th. If everyone's had a chance to read them, are there any errors, omissions? Not seeing any, I'll entertain the motion to receive them. Moved by Giguere, thank you for that. Seconder, please. McPhail. Catherine, call the vote, please.
Councillor Giguere.
Yes.
Councillor McPhail.
Yes.
Mike Andrews.
Yes.
Justin Pennings.
Yes.
Warden Marks.
Yes,
5-0, the motion is carried.
thank you for that. Item 3 is disclosure of pecuniary interests and the general nature thereof. Looking at everyone, no one's got their hand up. So move beyond that. Item 4 is Connectivity Committee Action Plan, reviewing the connectivity strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Hi, committee members. I just asked Catherine to share the presentation at this time. Just while that's loading, I'd just like to note that the last committee meeting on February 11th was a very productive meeting and one that provided some feedback and pretty clear direction for staff with respect to next steps and identifying a clear path forward. So the presentation that I've developed for today gets us a little bit closer to defining what next steps are for staff and keeping the momentum going for this project. So have we had any luck sharing the screen yet? Getting closer. So the agenda today is a pretty brief one.
There we are.
There's a couple of key items for discussion. One is we've invited the county engineer to do a presentation on Elgin County mapping capabilities. I'd like to discuss what prospective consultant role might be moving forward, define a letter or a process for letters of support, and then clarify any outstanding items for next steps. So when it comes to the discussion guide, I'd like to take a few minutes just to review the committee's work to date, working through the discussion guide and summarize the follow-up items that were identified by committee members. So in terms of the introduction, the committee did review an executive summary and some background materials. You also reviewed a link to council strategic plan, and there were no follow-up items identified in that section. With respect to part 1, which was preliminary data and assessment of the problem, we discussed what the problem is and how serious the gap is in Elgin County. And there was a follow-up item identified, which was technical assessment, needs assessment of served, unserved, underserved areas of Elgin County. And that was identified as something for a consultant. We discussed survey results and Another section was a lack of telecommunications infrastructure. And then as part of a general needs assessment section, a follow-up step was identified, which was mapping. So considering local challenges, including elevation, tree coverage, etc. So perhaps while we're at this point in the connectivity strategy, I might ask that Brian Lima jump in, and we may have to switch screens again, Catherine, but we'll talk about mapping.
Terrific. Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Julie. Give me a moment to pull up my screen. Can everybody see the map?
Yes.
Terrific. So based on the committee's discussion at the last meeting, county staff, with the support of our GIS technologists in-house, have prepared a mapping based on an array of available data. So first, relying upon Swiss data, we overlaid their service area data, and I can zoom into any particular area. This showcases existing fiber infrastructure that is noted to be in place and installed and made available to properties. We then have mapped various municipal and elementary and high schools that exist throughout the county. From a wireless solution consideration, zooming back out, we have with a list of multiple data sources, populated existing wireless equipment that exists throughout the county. Now, many of these pieces of equipment may be affixed to silos and or be standalone towers. In addition, have also obtained data from the Government of Canada with respect to topography. So the next step of the mapping process will entail, as the committee had discussed at the previous meeting, was to undertake a vendor assessment. That vendor assessment is required to, number one, confirm the existing equipment that exists at each one of these wireless tower or silo mounted locations, the height of that equipment, and better understand the capabilities associated with each of that equipment as well. With that information, we will then be able to map through the form of a heat map, for lack of better words, the range with which wireless coverage is available, as well as the quality of wireless signal available to residents throughout Elgin County. Now, the next step for which we've incorporated it is to identify all those properties registered through the tax roll and regarded as residential, as well as those properties which are, turn off the residential there, those properties which are, once again, taxed as being commercial properties. All this information is critical in understanding the availability or lack thereof with respect to connectivity throughout the county. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Brian? Go ahead. Brian, were there any surprises to you?
Not in particular, no. We certainly have begun some of our consultations with some of our member municipal partners in better understanding these locations. So I guess one surprise being that there's perhaps more wireless tower locations than we had anticipated. But again, we're subject to the committee's direction. If staff is to continue on the effort of trying to model wireless coverage, I think that's where we'll truly see the result of, or the extent of, the challenge that exists across the county.
I think the landscape is changing dramatically from even 6 months ago. I noticed one of my neighbors getting an installation yesterday from someone I used to do business with and quit because they were so terrible. So I'm assuming my neighbor's no fool, so obviously they've improved their services, at least I hope so. I think everyone, there's probably more option available today, as limited as it is compared to 6 months ago. Any further comments or questions for Brian? Duncan, I think you're muted. Are you trying to say something?
Okay, thank you. Just a little show and tell here of how mapping is fine, but I'm currently standing on my front porch, and I'm going to turn this around. Hopefully, can everybody see the property over my shoulder there?
Yes.
Okay. The situation, I've got a clear line of sight to a transmitting tower at 32 feet in the air up my aerial. That property next door to me, we've scoped it out, and for that individual to get the same service that I have because of tree cover between the transmitting tower and their property, they have to go up 54 feet to get the exact same thing that I've got. So it's very difficult with mapping you can generalize, but there are going to be a lot of individuals that are still going to fall through the cracks because of the tree cover that we're dealing with in the county. And it's really hard to imagine that just that short amount of distance would make that much difference.
Through you, Mr. Chair, another layer for which I did not click on is that we added was, in fact, the woodlot or tree canopy layer. So as part of our step 2 modeling, we'd be in a better position to identify some of those challenges for which Councillor McPhail is speaking about.
And just another question, Brian, does the mapping that you've got, does it take into consideration the elevation of individual properties?
Yes, it does. We're relying upon the Government of Canada's Canadian Digital Elevation and Surface Models.
Okay, because that makes an absolute huge difference also when you have a high tree cover and you're trying to hook up someone that is, you've got 75, 80-foot tree cover, and this individual is maybe 60, 70 feet lower in elevation. And it almost makes it impossible without having multiple sources of antennas to be able to hook these people up. If you can't get them one way, maybe there's a possibility of coming in another direction and getting them. And that's going to be something that's going to be challenging, I think, to get a real good understanding of just exactly what we can or we can't provide.
Yep, through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely acknowledged. Ensuring that we have topographic information, which we now have, woodlot and tree canopy information, but more importantly, part of that vendor assessment is confirming the height at which the equipment is mounted aerially. And so that'll drive, all those 3 elements will drive or better articulate some of the challenges that we're having.
Brian, can you share this information to all the committee?
Yep. Sorry, you'd like me to share the map again?
Well, no, just so we'll have it for
Oh,
ourselves.
I see. Absolutely.
No, with this information, would most of our like ISPs, would they have this information?
I would say the fiber coverage areas are readily available. All this information, I guess in short, is readily available online.
Okay.
Through multiple sources, and that you know, didn't take us very long to pull this together, to be honest with you.
Just at a quick glance, it really shows that there's not much fiber in the rural areas at all.
Yeah, I agree. It's generally restricted to built-up areas.
So we do have a challenge, which makes the reliance on wireless, certainly in the short term, you know, if you want to get coverage or if you want to get service in a hurry, that's probably the option for a while. Further comments?
Just one, Mr. Warden, with your permission. I did have a council meeting this morning, and part of that meeting, we did have Jeff Yurek in attendance. And I did discuss some of the committee's work. I was more, I guess, referring to West Elgin's specific situation, and I did bring up the topic of mapping. And I think that from Minister Yurek's perspective, he was in full support of that being a very good first step. And as I mentioned to him, we were going to be discussing it at the Elgin Connectivity Committee meeting today. And he was more than willing to offer up any support that he might be able to provide to us to accomplish this through any connections that he might have with the provincial government. So it's just a matter that if we can focus on anything that we might additionally need from the province, Minister Yurek is very approachable to listening to what we have to say to him. Quite possibly there might even be an opportunity through some level that we could maybe apply for some funding or something like that to accomplish this mapping project that we're looking at.
Sounds like a good idea. Looking towards Julie, we know that the RFP for Elgin County is ended now, but we're looking, I think, first part of March for how, when we get that information with this, it'll be another piece of the puzzle.
For sure. Yes, that'll be a critical component to the fiber layer.
Where they're intending to go,
Mm-hmm.
and which will help some areas, but maybe not others. And that should be within the next couple of weeks, you think?
I would anticipate that, yes.
Further questions, comments?
Just again, Mr. Warden, certainly not wanting to take up the whole meeting here. Brian, I know that that you did take the opportunity to reach out to Ministry of Transportation regarding the 401 corridor, and if there was possibilities of trying to eliminate the directional bore underneath the 401 by putting fiber across to certain overpasses using conduit. Did you get any response back from them?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor McPhail. I have not yet received anything formal in writing other than a brief telephone conversation committing to getting me something in writing. So I'm still waiting for that. I coincidentally had a discussion with our MTO local representative actually earlier this morning and brought this outstanding item up, for which he said he would follow up with the appropriate colleague right away. And so in other words, I'm hopeful that I'll see a response here in the next week. All in all, based on my verbal communications with them, they seem receptive to coming up with a solution that will satisfy all parties.
And certainly, you know, if push comes to shove, that's another rationale to go through Minister Yurek's office to kind of reinforce the necessity of We really need this in Elgin County, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Right. And the only other comment that I would make is that MTO staff to date have referenced other locations where fiber installation under a 400 series highway has been done before. So,
yeah, well, if we can eliminate that directional bore, which is fairly expensive as compared to overhead, I think that would be more attractive to a service provider to install the fiber that way. Maybe you could add to that, Mike. Is that a preferred route?
Yeah, absolutely. Utilizing an overpass as opposed to boring underneath the highway would shave a huge percent of the cost. And I don't want to throw numbers out, but I would expect it's probably 20% of the cost of boring a 400 series highway. It's substantially cheaper if in fact they would allow that.
And certainly number 3 highway would fall in there. Number 3 highway would fall in there as well.
Certainly a prize worth going after, I think. If we can establish those guidelines with MTO, it certainly strengthens our hand to encourage fiber work within Elgin County.
Further comments?
Just have a quick question, Mr. Warden, if I may.
Certainly.
A question for Brian. Is this mapping tool something that could be made available to the public? And could the public perhaps search by postal code and see the coverage in their own area, and then perhaps provide more information about situations such as like what Councillor McPhail pointed out, where it may appear on a map as though coverage is good, but they may have a different experience? Is that possible?
yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, I would say absolutely. This the mapping could be uploaded to the county's website anytime, and certainly once fully built out, we'd be able to create those search functions.
I think that information would be very helpful.
I think particularly once we get the vendors who are working in that area and the vendors that are available to do installations across Elgin, and make that list available for Elgin residents as well. That'll be a powerful tool.
Can we task you with following up on that, Brian, please?
Yes, happy to do so. Through Mr. Chair, I just ask that perhaps as a committee, we have a little bit more discussion on the next phase, being that vendor assessment. That's where the bulk of the work is now going to reside.
All right. Do you want to elaborate on that, or?
Sure. So as mentioned earlier, the next critical step path forward here with respect to creating the ultimate map, as discussed here, is going to involve a vendor assessment. And again, that involves confirming with each service provider what infrastructure actually exists in the field, confirming height of their equipment, capabilities with their equipment, ultimately leading us to be able to, or a consultant, in preparing a map, showcasing those coverage areas and ultimately also identifying or visually identifying those limitations as well.
If I may add, I don't know if I have the ability to do so, but maybe they give you people an idea of what it might look like. If I could share my screen, I'm going to try to attempt that just to give you an idea of what you might see in a wireless map. Let me try this, and if it works, great. So this is one of our proposed tower locations in our Malahide project, and this gives us an example of radios at 130 feet, taking into account houses that have antennas at the average of 20 feet off of the ground, taking into account second floor only, not TV antennas. And without getting into a lot of detail, it does take advantage of the tree coverage that you were asking about. And of course, it's now going to take its time here. Oops. You can kind of see as people were looking for service, you would see this particular location obviously wouldn't get service because of their height at 20 feet. We can go back into the same map afterward and try different heights until you get a what sort of coverage you're talking about. So Duncan mentioned 54 feet at one of his customers. That would just give it as an example. So I think what Brian is saying, when we go and ask these vendors about heights, that map is at a certain height, at a certain frequency, with a certain number of sectors, with a certain number of coverage. The more detail they give us, the more detailed this map can be. And ultimately, yes, it'll help the an end user to be able to find what they're looking for. But in case people are wondering what it looked like, that's just one example.
All right, thank you, Cecil. Appreciated that. Questions? Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we're quite wireless serviceability in the county, which I'm not saying is wrong. That's a very good start. But as far as our undertaking for mapping, I don't think you can't possibly be too granular with what we're doing here. So I'm just thinking about our existing county mapping has every residence, every farmhouse is plotted on existing mapping. I'm hoping that we're also going to be looking at the wireline providers. There is non-fiber wireline service out there that does meet the 50-10. And I think if the committee is going to get the true full picture of where the gaps are and where we really need to be concentrating on, that information will be critical too. And I'm hearing a lot about wireless, which is good, but are we also not looking at the existing wireline services within the county when we look at this map in detail?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Mike, we certainly would want to consider that as well, yes.
If I might add, again, just as my opinion through you, Chair, a lot of the information that's on the national broadband map, it's mostly, not that exclusively taking into account wired communications. It does show wireless, but because it's showing road segments as opposed to properties relative to buildings, it's still not quite as accurate. But I do agree with you, Mike. The wired part needs to be taken into account. There are other data sets out there I've looked at where there might be fiber access points, fiber cabinets that are not being run to a house or to a business. That might not be useful to us, but that would be useful to a third party like NFTC or PacketWorks to be able to know where those access point nodes are, so that if they wanted to get the third party service, they could expand their network from those locations. So I think that would go part and parcel with this, if I understand correctly, Brian.
Correct.
You started to get a little more technical than I can understand, but I think we're all headed in the same direction. Appreciate the comments, Mike. Further discussion? Duncan.
Mr. Warden, both Mike and to Cecil, maybe you can answer this question for me. Do you feel that the larger service providers are going to be forthcoming with, and I'm kind of referring mainly to the wireless side of it here, of what their coverage is, how many customers they actually do have hooked up within a certain area, and what maybe their future plans are, so we're not, chasing our tail here. If we know what people are doing, then we can focus on trying to assist them the best we can. You think that there's going to be a willingness for that information to freely come from the Bells and from the tech savvies and from the other ExploreNets of the world?
Yeah, I think, Duncan, you hit home on that point. There'll be far less, I expect, cooperation from the incumbent wireline providers to provide that level of detail. A lot of it is available publicly, as Cecil pointed out. But I think you'll see a difference between vendors as well as to how willing they are to share that. North Frontenac, for instance, I think has shared some pretty intricate details with this committee and with the public as a whole as to where they are and what they can provide. I'm not so sure that will be as easy to get from the other vendors, and I'm not I don't have a quick, easy answer of how to get that. You could hire a lot of people to do individual home bandwidth tests, but that would be enormously expensive, time consuming, and I think not probably too practical. So it will be challenging for sure, far more so I suspect than what we can get out of the wireless providers.
Further discussion?
Just like to ask one question, if I may, Mr. Warden.
Certainly.
So Brian, I got a sense that the vendor assessment and that component of the current state analysis may take some time, perhaps if it was handled or administered through engineering services. Is this something you'd recommend, that if we are engaging a consultant to undertake other work, that this be included in that consultant's work? Or is this something that engineering could reasonably take on?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, I would suggest if a consultant is to be engaged, this is something that could be added to their scope of work, at least to give the county staff at a minimum that background information, that baseline information, from which we could then continue building the map.
Would it be appropriate then for this committee to make that recommendation to county council?
Yeah, it's a little bit later in the presentation, so there's a few elements that the committee should kind of determine what the consultant would take on.
Okay.
But in terms of ongoing modeling, it would be helpful, I guess, if Brian, if you needed clear direction from the committee at this point, that you sought that out now. Is there a next step for Brian at this point in time, or shall we wait and have the discussion about the consultant later in the meeting?
I think probably we can move on until then, but thank you for that, Brian. Good information.
That's great.
Next steps?
So just going back to the discussion guide, the committee did review part 1, which included preliminary data, assessment of the problem, and for needs assessment, there were some follow-up items identified. We have noted that there is a technical assessment required for the unserved, underserved, and served areas. And then following that assessment, the committee could define the desired state. So we know a solution is needed, but we can't clearly articulate what that solution is until we have all of these other outstanding elements. So step 1 is mapping, including those local challenges, elevation, tree cover, looping back to the discussion that we just wrapped up. And then step 2 is an inventory of assets. And this was government and civic buildings, which was a layer that Brian identified, and including those on the map. And then Councillor McPhail at the last meeting pointed out that there are a number of other privately owned infrastructure components that could potentially be included on the map in the future. So with respect to ongoing work, that would be an assessment of demographic needs by municipality, including economic challenges and opportunities, as well as emergency preparedness. Part 2 was the introduction to planning and developing the connectivity strategy. So the committee reviewed what is a connectivity strategy, the importance of community engagement in developing this strategy, challenges to connecting Elgin, and then the current state assessment. This is where the committee directed staff to, as much as possible, develop a connectivity map, which would include the SWIFT network and the installation once it's approved. Step 2 would be to collect, organize, and make publicly available this baseline data and key contact information. So the population, estimated number of households, businesses, those elements that Brian mentioned, and then the types of available offerings of ISPs, including related issues, which Brian and Cecil both pointed out. So ongoing work, assessment of this demographic data by municipality is important. And I think it's critically important, as I mentioned at your last meeting, to seek unbiased, objective technical expertise to assess which technological solutions are most cost effective and which will work best in each of these challenging areas. And I've noted that that is potential work for a consultant, should you recommend that to council. Skipping ahead to part 2, which is introduction and planning, developing the strategy, vendor assessment, which Brian just mentioned, collect, organize, and make publicly available types of offerings available from the ISPs. And we've just noted that we'll carry that discussion forward to when we contemplate what the work of a consultant may include. Strategic framework was part 3. The committee reviewed guiding principles and decided to follow up on that at a later date. Partnerships, follow-up item there was to review and support local ISP applications for external funding. And there is a slide in today's deck that addresses that. Non-financial strategies, the committee contemplated, and I believe it was Councillor Jaguar who brought this up, exit interviews for ISPs. And so we decided to discuss this at a future meeting, and I have included a slide where we can determine some next steps there. And then another item for Brian Lima, he's still on the call, is explore measures to reduce deployment costs, speed up deployment, reduce any barriers to entry. And a follow-up item for Brian was to give consideration to how we handle minimum depth requirements, access to intersection bridges, county roads. So Brian, can I turn things over to you?
Yes, absolutely. So at the present time, Elgin County Engineering Services works very closely with the various ISP, interested ISP service providers who are looking to expand their network or maybe install their network for the first time along county roads. And we work very closely with them through the detailed design phase and ultimately leading through through implementation of that fiber installation. A recent example of that is Uplink as it relates to New Sarum. Oftentimes, depth requirements will be dictated by other infrastructure that may be in existence, already in existence, or planned to be in existence in future. And so when county engineering services staff are reviewing applications and drawings that are submitted, we take into consideration those plans and are also mindful of and ensure that we also consult with our member municipalities who may also have infrastructure within our road allowances. So moving forward, I think having a clear set of minimum guidelines or standards may be of benefit for all parties, not just for county staff, but also for ISP service providers. And I propose that we work closely with them to develop those standards. And quite frankly, similar standards may already exist throughout the industry, for which we would just also consult with some of our county municipal partners and inquire as to what may already exist out there. There wouldn't be significant variation from likely standards that already exist out there. So again, in summary, we work very closely with the ISP service providers and aim to reduce any sort of limitations or hurdles that may exist.
Thank you, Brian. Any discussion what Brian just mentioned?
How far away are you, Brian, from being able to have a prescribed set of requirements from your engineering department that would be made available to ISPs that could possibly be interested in doing work in Elgin County?
Through Mr. Chair, Councilor McPhail, I would suggest we would need several weeks to following consultation with them to compile a set of standards relatively quickly thereafter. at which point then we can also table them before the committee and present them as well.
And just to try to make it as seamless as possible, those standards on county roads, is there a possibility to having the lower tier municipalities work setting those standards so it's seamless across the county, that these are the rules both for the county and for the lower tier municipalities?
Through Mr. Chair, yeah, I agree. Having a coordinated set of standards that all parties can agree to would certainly make it easier for the ISPs to follow. Absolutely.
Brian, we approved one on Tuesday at our council meeting. I know that individual was quite pleased with the cooperation, and it seemed to be fairly easy for him. So I took that to be a good sign. So, and I think Central Elgin was probably involved there. So I think that exercise seemed to go well. So that was a good start, I would say.
Yeah, through Mr. Chair, assuming a complete submission is made, having detailed, accurate other as constructed infrastructure details also shown on the drawings, county engineering service staff review time is within 2 weeks.
That's certainly acceptable. Yeah, that cooperation is very helpful.
Just one more question, Mr. Warden. Is it, and I don't know who needs to answer this question or what the answer even is, but as we move forward as a committee and certainly requesting that county engineering put together a standard for Elgin County, my concern is how is that going to relate to the lower tier municipalities with their official buy-in of the plan? Is that going to be through the members of county council, like from this committee to the members of county council, to take that back to their respective municipalities and get the appropriate resolutions passed? Have we thought that far ahead, or am I too far down the road?
Julie, do you want to?
Sure. So I think it's a combination of two means. Brian can, as much as possible, coordinate with the local public works folks, and we can work with CAOs at the administrator level across the county. And then I do think that once the committee reviews the proposed guidelines, that does go to county council, and then I would certainly recommend that county council then take it back, each individual councilor take it back to their respective councils for support. So that would be kind of the two-pronged approach to getting folks on board with this strategy.
I agree. I think every chance county council has identified this as a top priority. So any chance we get to remind lower tier cooperation is very beneficial, and keep repeating that. You know, and we want to keep this moving ahead. That satisfy you, Duncan?
Yeah, I just, you know, I assumed that would be the way forward in a perfect world, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way, and I'm just you know, wanting to make sure that if this is an Elgin County initiative, that it also includes the lower tier municipalities as willing partners, and we're not putting gaps, because I would really like to have everything bundled up for an ISP, that whether you're working off a county road and then you're working into Dunwich and then you cross over into West Elgin, that the rules are the same, the game is the same, and you're not as a contractor or a service provider trying to find out what the rules are.
I think it's certainly this committee, we can do whatever we can to keep reminding our fellow councilors, et cetera, and anyone who will listen, that this is a top priority, and Certainly, we're not looking to bend rules or everyone has a role, but cooperation is paramount. All right, thank you for that, Brian. Further questions, discussion?
Well, just a quick question to Mike. As being experienced in this process, are we heading down the right track?
Yeah, I certainly believe so. And I just, not to make a huge deal of this either, because I can assure you, Elgin County, both at the county level and the lower tier municipalities are very accommodating and generally very easy to deal with. It is, but the need or the helpfulness, I think, of standardization and not having to deal with multiple, even if they are small differences in approach by the lower tiers, I think will help service providers an enormous amount. But again, I do want to say Elgin County is an extremely cooperative and relatively easy municipality and county to deal with. Their lower tier municipalities and county to deal with compared to many parts of this province, large and small. Even some rural municipalities, strangely enough, seem to be somewhat resistant to what I see as relatively easy things to look at, such as, depth of cover and what's required as far as permitting and costs of permits. But I think we're absolutely on the right path. And I just having personal experience with most of the municipalities across Elgin, I think this is doable, and I'm pretty confident that the lower tiers will be more than cooperative with the county in establishing a very friendly place from an administrative perspective for ISPs to do business in.
That's encouraging to hear, Mike. If I could ask you a question, if some of our water towers, is there anything wrong with having 2 or 3 companies having an antenna up there? Do they interfere? Is it putting any of the lower tiers assets in danger?
I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer that. Maybe Cecil might be a better place to answer that. But it can be done. I mean, there are multiple frequencies available. There always has to be cooperation, and certainly from a county perspective or a lower tiers perspective, if they have critical infrastructure, any kind of agreements that you would make with a wireless provider, you obviously have to protect the assets of the municipality and make sure that if interferences are an issue, that you don't turn off the SCADA system because it's interfering with the ISP. It has to be the reverse. But those kinds of agreements there's lots of that out there, and it is doable. Spectrum is limited for sure, but there are ways to manage multiple providers off a single structure.
What do you think, Cecil?
No, I agree with Mike. As long as you have frequency separation, it should not be an issue. But obviously, if it's a SCADA site, water tower, SCADA, whatever the case might be, it definitely takes priority over anything else.
Well, absolutely, because they have to protect their assets, but if it's possible, it is that low-cost siting. But all right, other questions, comments?
Just while we're on the topic of towers, Brian, were you able to find out any more information about the tower that is by White Station?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm unfortunately still waiting for a formal response from tourists as well. They are aware of the committee's interest and seemed to be, in a brief telephone conversation with them, seemed to be willing to consider others to occupy their tower, which exists at the county's White Station property. But I will formalize a response once I get that.
So to clarify, Brian, you just said that it's their tower?
That's correct, yes. Tourist Communications Incorporated has an agreement with the County of Elgin and occupies a portion of the property for their tower. So it's their equipment, and it's our further understanding that they already have other companies which are also occupying their structure. So again, just awaiting a response from them in that regard.
All right, look forward to that.
Just, Mr. Warden, and certainly Cecil, feel free to jump in here. You know, even the water towers do have a limited reach out into the community, and unfortunately, without intermediate transmission towers, that ability to get into underserviced areas wirelessly is somewhat hampered without those additional towers to help spread the signal around. Is that a fair statement, Cecil?
Through your chair to Duncan, yes. The analogy I think I used in our last meeting was the cellular towers. Late 80s, early 90s, you could have one tower every 20 kilometers because of the sheer output strength. But as speed increases, the distance that it can travel is shorter and shorter and shorter, which is why you see so many more cell towers. And this is no different. If we want to make sure that we have sufficient high speed distributed cleanly and with an easy access, we need more sites to host more towers. They don't all have to be large, but they have to be tall enough, obviously, to be able to reach a decent distance.
So that begs the question. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Duncan. Go ahead.
So that begs the question that you know, certainly we're not going to be in a situation where we're going to have a tremendous amount of fiber up and down every concession road. Does that lead the question up? Is it something that that municipalities, whether we wish to or not, are going to be forced into you know, providing strategically placed towers that are owned by the municipality?
Do you want to answer that, Cecil?
I'll answer, I guess, the best I can. I'll use Malahide as the example. That is one of the projects that we're pursuing, trying to find if it's a feasible option that we build multiple, at least two, but potentially multiple communication towers, primarily for our own use, similar to the SCADA system, except that in our case, it's our own private network, leaving enough space, though, for third-party WISPs to be able to occupy it. I think there's a role to be played for that, and that's something this committee would obviously have to consider as we go forward. I definitely think that there is a certain responsibility to a certain extent. If I might, Al, just bring Al in briefly, he might remember this meeting. There was a SWIFT meeting in London, I think it was 10 or 12 years ago, and they had brought up the cost of fiber compared to building a road, and I think the number they used was something like 2%, 3%. Maybe Al can bring me back if he remembers that at all. So it's relatively inexpensive compared to a road. Yes, I know we have to find the money for it. So obviously that's where the committee comes in. Is there a place for it? My personal opinion, and it's just my opinion, is a hybrid approach makes sense. Towers and fiber. You get fiber to the towers. You kind of get the best of both worlds. If you have short distance hops, you should be able to get the high speed connections. With the way wireless technology has evolved in the last 10 years, you can get gigabit speeds now out of wireless. Do we need it? Not right now, but in the future we could. And as the speeds increase, generally speaking, the cost comes down. Just as an example, and again, I don't want to go on too long here, but I remember installing a wireless bridge at one municipality about 12 years ago, and it was $28,000 to go 54 megabit. And now I can put in a 2 gigabit fiber link, wireless link for just over $6,000. So infinitely faster at a fraction of the cost. That's why I do think ultimately a hybrid solution makes sense, even if it's just a stopgap until full fiber gets deployed in the future. But it's to me, it's the best of both worlds.
Cecil, I think you know where I live on Ferguson Line, and there is a tower on the grain elevators at Ferguson's. And if you drive slow down Ferguson Line, you can see the Belmont water tower. So if the signal was bounced off there to there, would it be possible to run fiber down Ferguson Line?
Through your chair, I guess to your chair. I'll be honest, one has nothing to do with the other. The issue with the Belmont water tower, and Mike alluded to this, is height. The issue with wireless is it's not a single horizontal plane you have to worry about. And forgive me, I'm going to try to draw this. Wireless kind of operates with a cone facing each other, and you need a certain amount of clearance from the bottom of that cone. So even though the water tower seems high enough, when you take into account how the actual wireless signal is being transmitted, probably 30 or 40% of that signal is lost just going into the ground. And that doesn't even take into account the curvature of the earth, which you wouldn't think at 15 or 20 kilometers would be that much, but it adds up quite quick. But ideally, yes, fiber to the towers, as much as wherever you can, as much as possible, and then you feed the towers from there, and then again, a number of towers, you can have some redundancy if you need it, so that if fiber gets cut, you can have service still. But again, my opinion, that's my personal opinion, and that's it.
But the benefit of having the water towers available is, I guess, basically just saving the cost of another tower. Is that fair to say?
The way I've sort of looked, I would agree, Chair. My perspective, and we know you've referenced the SCADA system as an example. If I can get fiber to a water tower, that means I can get rid of the wireless SCADA system, which gives you a superior connection for your SCADA system, also while feeding an internet connection to a third-party WISP. So you're kind of solving one problem with the other, if that makes any sense. Fiber in to have better SCADA while providing access for third parties.
That makes sense. Thank you, Cecil. Further discussion, more questions for Cecil? I think that was helpful for me, Cecil. Appreciate it.
Just a quick question for Cecil. As we're talking about towers, I think rule of thumb would be at least 150-foot tower.
I can't, sorry, through your chair, I can't speak for everybody. I know if you look at a typical cell tower, some of the, when one's being built and I see a plan come across my desk, I think they're averaging 150 feet or greater. So if you want to do a general rule of thumb and look at a cell tower, I'm not saying that's the way that you necessarily need to lean, but there's a reason they're picking that height.
Yeah, we've just had two. Xplornet has just, in fact, at our council meeting this morning, we just authorized a 44, 45 meter tower, which I guess is pretty close to 150-foot height. They're just putting up two towers in West Ogden. In fact, they've got one up, and they're going to put another one up. Seems to me that's kind of where everybody is going for. And am I depending on how much work needs to be done to access those to electricity, of course, to operate the tower, and whether there needs to be a roadway put in. Are we talking somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 for a 150-foot tower?
Sorry, through your chair, I know some of the prices we've looked at, and a lot of it has to do with ground engineering, so the quality of the soil and such. 130-foot tower at least 2 years ago, the material cost was about $80,000, but by the time you installed it and built it, it was about $180,000. And that also comes down to the sizing of it. Is it a light duty, medium duty, heavy duty? What sort of weight load are you going to have it on it? Wind load, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot will come down to what equipment you're putting up there, and that'll help determine the size of the tower, which will then obviously drive the cost up.
Okay.
But again, if a water tower was available, that's saving that cost in one instance anyway. Okay. Further discussion. Julie?
So jumping back to the discussion guide, the committee did discuss some non-financial strategies, and as two key follow-up items, one was reduce administrative burden by working with local municipal partners to understand and refine the local application requirements, permit processes, and costs. So certainly the committee identified one opportunity there, and I think hopefully as we work closely with our LMPs, we'll be able to identify some other opportunities. So that's ongoing. The next follow-up item was to establish a single point of contact at the county to work with local telecoms and ISPs. And I suggest that this be the Director of Information Technology Services once they are hired. Contemplating funding was another area that the committee didn't quite get to at the last meeting, but is included in the strategy. Just as a recap, it was recommended, and I think generally agreed upon by the committee, that this be a topic for future discussion and follow receipt of technical assessment and outstanding information. So to wrap up the discussion guide, the committee also looked at next steps and additional information and resources that had been compiled by staff. So again, thank you to the committee for providing really valuable feedback into what the next steps were for staff. You can see the results of that today with presentation from county engineer. So thanks to Brian for his team's great work on the mapping and their commitment to next steps and continuing to provide the committee with more information on an as needed basis. We did discuss exit interviews, and I noted earlier in the presentation we'd be looping back to this. So two topics were pitched. One was, do we survey ISPs who have recently completed work in Elgin County? And the other was to either interview those ISPs or invite them to present to the Connectivity Committee, both of which I think are great suggestions. And I think a hybrid approach could certainly be adopted here. But what would be helpful for staff to know is kind of the goal, and we can work backwards from the goal. What do you hope to gather from these conversations or the survey feedback coming from the ISPs? And what are the specific questions that we could include both in a discussion guide or suggested presentation or survey? So I think I know that the goal is, or understand that the goal is to find out what barriers existed or what Elgin County could do to make it easier for ISPs in future installations. But as I was jotting down this presentation, it did occur to me I could use a bit more direction from the committee. So additional comments and feedback is welcome.
All right. Do you have any comments? Dominique, you brought it up. Do you have any suggestions, comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to take credit because I believe it was Mike who brought it up, but
Okay.
I'm certainly very much in support. I was trying to remember. So I'm wondering if the suggestions for questions would come from ISPs. And for me, it would be very simple because we don't want to create burden in an attempt to remove a burden. And but basically questions just talking about the ease, the speed, and the cost, and any suggestions to make it easier to work with our municipality. That helps.
Well, if we identified what was easy, we want to keep doing it. Do you have any comments, Mike?
One comment I'll make, it wasn't Mike that brought this up. I'm not sure. I think it might have been Duncan, not to
I can't
pass the buck.
remember.
Brought it up.
Thank you to everyone.
It was a good idea. I'll take credit.
Yeah, I think that the intent, in my view anyway, is absolutely, if we're doing everything right, then let's keep doing it and not wreck it by creating a bureaucracy that doesn't exist today. And if there's things that the county can do to make it less challenging for ISPs, then I think it's just kind of, in my view anyway, it kind of leads into what our engineering group need to have in their hands as far as trying to make things a little bit easier for ISPs. So that's my comment.
Okay,
It's great.
that helps? All right,
Very helpful.
next.
So the next slide.
Just one more comment on this, Mr. Warden. My thoughts initially on this were just a simple marketing tool that if we can get our act together, then we can present Elgin to the ISPs as a real good place to do business.
Good point. Dominique's nodding her head.
Mhm.
Comment, Dominique?
Yeah, I was going to say something along this of both as an invitation, do you have any suggestions, especially if you work in the past? And yeah, and so they could respond just to that invitation, and I think it would be a great promotion piece, while we would get at the same time information on how we can remove barriers. And if they want to go further and come to the committee and present and explain further what the barriers are, then that's great. We can welcome that. But yeah, I would agree with that sort of promo. So even if it's a company that has not done work with our municipality yet, they could still be invited to respond. And that information actually could also inform the standards that the engineering team is trying to develop.
Okay. Very good.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
So the next slide does point out some conversation starters. It's not meant to be a comprehensive list, but suggests some ideas for how we may leverage some consultant support to keep the priorities of the committee and council advancing. So the discussion that came out of last meeting was what can be done in-house, what is more appropriately handled by a consultant or expert in the field. So I've suggested that we need expert support for the development of a community plan for connectivity, which would include unbiased, objective technical expertise to assess which technology solutions are most cost-effective and might work best to reach underserved areas of Elgin's municipalities. And the note there is that the consultant would actually recommend community-specific solutions and hopefully recommend some sort of program or installation initiative that could be funded by Elgin County, or that they could perhaps somehow build off of that planning for to leverage senior government funding from senior levels of government. So I'll stop there, and perhaps Mr. Warden, you accept questions or comments, and we can break this down.
Certainly. Open it for comments, thoughts, opinions. Go ahead.
Cecil, through your warden. Oh, sorry. I was just going to suggest maybe just to, and Dominique has mentioned this in the past about we're trying to get this going, we're trying to roll forward, we want to keep momentum going. Maybe part of this, yes, look at a consultant, but can we start handing over information that we have? I know it's not spectacular, that map that Brian presented earlier, it's a point to start with. Is there documents at the municipalities that might show as-built infrastructure like Northern Frontenac? Not that we have to give them specifics, but we know there's fiber in this area that may not be showing on Swift. As there fiber cabinets, I've alluded to it before. I have a personal map going of locations I've stumbled across while driving through the county. And I've shared some of that information already. It just might help the consultant just get a really good start as opposed to starting from scratch. So that would be one suggestion I would have. Approach the lower tiers. Maybe they have some information that we're not even aware of that they can share up to the committee.
Well, I think that's very important. I think Dominique will agree. I certainly share her passion. We we want to keep running. We don't want to slow down. And you only have to have a bad day with a bad internet connection. And that's why I'm in the office right now today. And Dominique has, I think, struggled a bit today. So it's a quick reminder that we need to keep this as fast as we can. So good point. Like, add to that, Dominique?
Yeah, so I wanted to say again, something along the same line. So I think on one hand, yes, we are ready. I think this committee has gone as far as we can in a committee structure. And so I think to take us to the next step, we need a consolidated effort, but a third party objective who can consolidate everything that we have done. So what I'm trying to avoid is two things. That I wouldn't want the scope of work to repeat anything that we have done. I think this committee has done good work in uncovering what we don't know. It was an exercise of we didn't know what we didn't know and what we needed. I think now we have information, and but we still have some gaps and we need some recommendations. So that's why, like Cecil said, we need to build on what's already been accomplished. At the same time, can we make everything that's been accomplished already useful, exactly as Cecil described? So I think there are things that we can do in parallel that are continuing to genuinely advance this this overall connectivity strategy.
Okay. Other comments? Okay, Julie?
Great. So the next point, there is some overlap because the first section there was pretty general and high level. So this next section would be to identify existing last mile and transport solutions, identify key internet access and gateway points and choke points, areas of limited capacity, and then provide documented support as to practical considerations around speed and consideration. So I have made note that we will build on existing materials that have been developed by this committee, and will seek consultant support to perhaps validate existing information and identify any gaps on perhaps the maps and the existing information. We'll seek out as much information in advance of securing the consultant in order to provide the best package possible to a consultant. But are there other kind of key pieces of information that we are seeking from the consultants that would inform the committee in a way that you would be able to develop a program or a strategy, or support a program or a strategy that might be recommended by a consultant?
Comments, questions for Julie? Are we in agreement? I think we are, but someone say it out loud. We're at that point where we need that expert advice, consultant, and I think, is there a feeling that we want, like today, like let's get going on it?
Yeah, I would say I certainly would support that. I feel that what you have, Julie, everything you've identified as a potential scope, I think seems to be exactly what we need. I can't think of anything else.
Mr. Ward, I'd make a recommendation that we convey that thought to County Council to move on. The committee has matured to the point that we are going to require the expertise to come in and move us to the next level.
I think that's a great motion. I think that's what probably county council is expecting of us. So you make that a motion. I'd look for a seconder to that motion. Dominique, thank you for that. Julie, can you read the motion out?
That the Elgin County Connectivity Committee recommend that County Council engage a consultant to support the committee's work in identifying community-specific solutions and a possible funding program for Elgin County with respect to enhancing connectivity across Elgin County.
I'm certainly fine with that. We'll have a discussion in a second and then put it to a vote. We meet in what, a couple more weeks for county council?
March 8th.
March 8th, rather than wait to March 8th and get the approval, hopefully, and start, can we surmise that we will get approval and maybe encourage Julie to start preparing for that? Are we at that point? No sense waiting until March 8th and then open the file and start then. The next couple of weeks, we can start piecing together what we want in a consultant. Is that too bold of me to suggest?
Mr. Warden, just, you know, I don't want to get out too far ahead of county council. I think we have to bring them all along, and I know that it's going to be a couple of weeks of sitting around and waiting. I would hope that they would be in agreement with this, but certainly I think that we had better take it to our colleagues and explain carefully what the committee has come up with, and then proceed with their blessing. I don't know what you think about it, Dominique.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I would be more comfortable. I suppose that there's always a bit of background work in terms of preparing in doing the research for RFPs and similar RFPs. I suppose that, you know, staff can do it behind the scenes, as they probably do anyway, so that they can hit the ground running. But yeah, I would like a full council. One thing I noticed in the motion is that the consultant would also include recommendations on a possible funding program. And I'm wondering if that might be out of scope. Would a technical expert be also in a position to make recommendations for possible funding programs? I support all the other points that are technical, but would we narrow the field? Would a technical expert be in a position to make that recommendation?
I can't answer that, Julie.
I don't actually know. So if it is the committee's desire to just seek out the technical piece, I haven't actually tested the market, so I have no idea whether that combination would exist. My thought was that if they provide some, you know, the gaps of service and solutions, community-specific solutions, then they might also be able to identify kind of a sort of funding structure that might benefit local ISPs or incentivize ISPs to do their installation. But perhaps that is work that could be hived off and undertaken by the committee using the technical information. I don't actually know, but perhaps other committee members might have more insight into that. What types of consultants exist and whether we would be limiting ourselves by combining them.
Comments? What's your thoughts, Justin? I don't want to and I will apologize. I was not trying to spring a surprise on county council, but I guess in my enthusiasm, keep this moving, but
well, Mr. Warden, I kind of want, I support the technical consultant fully. I wonder if they're going to have a hard time determining what the final mile actually is until we hear from the SWIFT RFP, kind of knowing their scope and timelines. Otherwise, I think we risk some duplication.
well, I hear you. I think we said earlier, within the next 2 or 3 weeks, we should have an idea what SWIFT is. So it's sort of on the doorstep. And we're certainly not going to hire anyone overnight. So hopefully we just keep going the same direction, then they will align, but point taken. Are we ready to vote on the motion? Further discussion?
So, Mr. Chair, just as a follow-up, perhaps there's a way to just modify the funding aspect to make it so that it's not a barrier. So maybe it could be, that in the RFP it's worded that if possible, or, where possible, recommend financial or funding solutions. So that's the amendment to the motion that I would suggest.
Are you fine with that, Duncan?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're at a point that I think that we've exhausted the ability of certainly myself as a committee member here, what I know about wireless and fiber. You could probably put in a teaspoon, and unfortunately for myself to go any farther, I do need some type of guidance that from someone that understands both those issues and can advise certainly myself and probably the rest of the committee as to what our next steps should be. I know that the SWIFT proposal is coming forward, but that I'll tell you, there's going to be a lot of miles left over by the time they make their announcement. What is it, for $6 million? There's still going to be a ton of people that are not going to have decent broadband. So we as a committee have got a lot of work ahead of us, and probably it's going to be a lot of years before we can safely say that we've accomplished our mission.
Yeah, I think they're saying 78% will still need to be serviced. Again, this will be another piece of the puzzle, which will answer some questions, probably create some questions, but I'm getting the sense that we're in agreeing on the motions. We'll ask Catherine to go ahead and call the motion. Is that all right with everyone?
Can I add, can I further amend this? Because I've had a second thought, which is, I think we want to know the community specific solution and the estimated costs. So perhaps it's less about a funding program, and it's more about what would this solution that you're proposing in each community cost? And then if possible, provide us with a possible funding program or suggestion there. So I would just suggest that amendment.
Okay. Sounds good to me. This screen is fairly small, but I've seen some heads nodding. Do we have an agreement with that amendment to the motion?
Yeah.
Fine with me.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I could just make one very small suggestion. I think from my perspective, we'd be looking more for a funding model perhaps, as opposed to a funding proposal from a consultant. I don't know if that makes it more palatable or not, but I share the concerns that have already been discussed about it's a tall order for, I think, a single consultant to cover this whole, but hopefully the technical assessment leads into an hopefully obvious funding model, if there is such a thing out there for us as a County of Elgin. But I think we're looking for a model as opposed to a program. That's my comments, and then I'm quite prepared to support that motion.
Okay, I like that word. Are we ready to call the vote then? Catherine, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Councillor Giguere,
Yes.
Councillor McPhail,
Yes.
Mike Andrews,
Yes.
Justin Pennings,
Yes.
Mr. Warden.
Yes.
5-0, the motion is carried.
Thank you, Catherine. Next up's
Can I just ask a question?
certainly.
So I will prepare as much information as I can to support an RFP, present that to County Council on March 8th on behalf of the committee. I'm just curious to know whether the committee has a desire to see the RFP before it is issued, or is it sufficient that if council consents to it, we can just carry on with it? We're happy to do as the committee desires. I just don't want to take a misstep.
Thoughts? Which should mean another meeting?
I would welcome, I don't have a desire, I don't know that I would be able to add to it, but I know there are more technically inclined people on the committee. Perhaps it would be beneficial. If you think, Julie, that's beneficial, it would just be for, if you think it helps to strengthen the RFP and make sure we covered everything, or we worded in a way that will appeal to the, broadest scope of consultants possible, if other members are willing, and if you think that helps.
I think it would help tremendously. The other option is we could skip a full meeting and a couple of committee members could perhaps volunteer to review it.
Mr. Chair, I would certainly, as a committee member, welcome the opportunity to review that before it's actually issued. And I'm perfectly fine with an ad hoc meeting. It doesn't have to be a 2-week delay scheduled meeting from my perspective. I would make time for it. But I think my own thoughts are, I would like to see it. I think the committee should see it before it's actually published.
I think that'd be a great suggestion. I'd certainly appreciate your comments on it, Mike. Duncan has stated his expertise and mine is slightly behind that. So I certainly value your opinion, and Cecil's and the rest of the technical people here. So I think we have a consensus here, direction, or do you want to?
Yes, I think we'll, as we continue to navigate the pandemic and anticipate some changes coming in our community's color zone, I'll do my best to get as much done in the coming week, and I'll just be in touch with the warden. He'll call a meeting if needed.
And I think the arrival of the information from SWIFT sooner or later is going to help as well. And if that shows up tomorrow or 23 days from now, it's going to impact it a bit as well. All right.
Just one final comment, Mr. Warden. I think the decision that we're making today is probably the best decision that we can make today. But I think, at least from my perspective, that I fully realize that this isn't the end. This is just the beginning. And this probably will change a number of times as we move forward.
I think that's a very wise statement. I agree fully. Are we at the point of correspondence?
Nope, we're still, I still have a few more items
Okay,
that
go ahead.
outstanding from the connectivity strategy. A quick one that I think we can cover off seamlessly when we take a recommendation to council about consultant is also to streamline the process for letters of support. So my recommendation is that council delegate this responsibility to the warden, and that when ISPs come to the committee for support, a letter of support, when possible, we'll invite them to the committee when timelines are long enough. Otherwise, the warden, based on the 4 primary challenges that we know need to be addressed in Elgin County, could just issue that letter of support at his discretion. So that's my recommendation. We'd be happy to include that within the broader recommendation to council on March 8th.
Thoughts on that recommendation?
Do you need a motion for that, Mr. Warden?
I think that would be helpful, Councillor McPhail.
Then it will be a record, so.
So moved.
Seconder, please. Did I hear you, Justin? Okay.
Justin,
Just, okay, thank you. Please, Catherine, call the vote.
Counselor Jiguer.
Yeah.
Counselor McPhail.
Yes.
Mike Andrews.
Yes.
Justin Pennings,
Yes.
Mr. Warden.
Yes,
5-0, the motion is carried.
thank you, Catherine.
That's it.
That's it. We have a couple of items of correspondence. Are they just to receive and file, or just,
For the committee's information.
does anyone need anything to discuss on them, or have you read them or questions? Hearing none. Do we need a motion to receive and file? A mover and seconder, please, to receive and file. Please speak out there. I can see Mike. I can't see some of the others.
Pennings.
Okay, Mike and Justin. Catherine, please.
Counselor Jiguer,
Yes.
Counselor McPhail,
Yes,
Mike Andrews,
Yes.
Justin Pennings,
Yes.
Mr. Warden.
Yes.
5-0, the motion is carried.
All right, our next item, it looks like date of our next meeting.
Or maybe items for new business. if
Oh,
anyone has
yes.
Anything.
Does anyone have anything for new business? Sorry. Not seeing any.
Is Al Reitsma on the call?
Al, are you on the call?
He had to leave.
Okay,
Okay.
all right. Next
Meeting.
meeting date, do we want to set a date on a 2-week cycle, or do we want to call chair, or two-week cycle and stick with it? Which will be into March.
March 11th.
2:00 work for everyone? Okay. With that, I think we're at the point of adjournment. Need a mover and seconder, please. Dominique and McPhail, Pennings, okay. Catherine, once more.
Counselor Jiguer,
Yes.
Counselor McPhail,
yes.
Mike Andrews,
Yes.
Justin Pennings,
Yes.
Mr. Warden.
Yes,
5-0, the motion is carried.
all right. Want to thank everyone for your participation. It's appreciated. I think we're going in the right direction. Have a good day. Stay safe. Take care.